What if human history wasn't shaped by humans alone? What if the real forces behind civilization were ice cores, ocean sediments, and even the wobble of Earth's orbit? Long before human life began, climate was already writing the story. The book is called Climate Change and the Course of Global History. It asks an enormous question. How has the history of the Earth itself shaped the history of the human condition? Most historians have long avoided this question entirely. They feared sounding like crude environmental determinists. This book draws on a revolution in climate science underway since the 1960s. Nearly every major turning point in human history, it argues, was triggered by something else. Not overpopulation, as the economist Thomas Malthus famously claimed. Instead, sudden, externally driven climate shocks were the true cause. This pattern runs from the rise of the first cities, to the fall of Rome, to the Black Death. The author, John L. Brooke, is a distinguished professor of history at Ohio State University, where he directs the Center for Historical Research. He has won major prizes for his earlier books on colonial and revolutionary America, and on Mormon history. Those earlier works gave little hint of the planetary ambitions to come. This book represents a dramatic widening of his ambition. It attempts to fuse the methods of professional history with the hard data of Earth system science. It does so across the entire span of human existence. Let's start where the book starts, with the deep machinery of the planet itself. This isn't the usual starting point for a history book, and the book is upfront about that choice. Long before there were humans, the book argues, the Earth's history already followed a pattern. Long calm periods were suddenly broken by catastrophe. Massive volcanic superplumes, rising from deep within the planet's mantle, periodically reshaped continents and oceans. A meteor strike 65 million years ago wiped out the dinosaurs and opened the world to mammals. That strike left behind a thin layer of iridium, which a geologist discovered outside an Italian village. This single layer of rare metal showed up at the same depth in rock formations worldwide. It became the calling card of a planet-altering catastrophe. Other forces worked at an even larger scale. The book describes how massive plumes of molten rock rise from deep within the Earth's mantle. These plumes have repeatedly ruptured continents and triggered mass extinctions throughout the planet's history, completely independent of any meteor. This pattern of long stability followed by sudden punctuation would become the central rhythm of the entire book. The book borrows this idea directly from biology. In the 1970s, paleontologists Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge proposed a theory. They called it punctuated equilibrium. They argued evolution doesn't creep forward at a steady pace, the way Charles Darwin originally imagined. Instead, species stay remarkably stable for long stretches. Then they change suddenly, in short, intense bursts, usually right after some environmental catastrophe clears away the competition. The book applies this same logic to the whole of human history. Long periods of relative stability, it argues, get violently interrupted by climate shocks. Those shocks then open space for genuinely new ways of living. Darwin himself worked in a calmer intellectual age. He had no way of anticipating how violent and uneven that pace of change would turn out to be. That same rhythm, the book argues, also shaped humanity's own emergence. Around 8 million years ago, a volcanic rift began tearing East Africa apart. It lifted mountains and dried out the landscape. The climate there grew not just drier, but wildly unstable, swinging between drenching wet periods and brutal droughts. Our ancestors evolved not toward any single specialized niche, but toward sheer adaptability. This is what the Smithsonian's Richard Potts calls the variability selection hypothesis. Unpredictable swings between forest and savanna, the book argues, favored creatures who could change their diet. They could map shifting landscapes mentally, and cooperate in flexible social groups. Climate instability, in other words, may be the single best explanation for why we became human at all. Around the same time, a related but separate disaster was unfolding to the north. The slow collision of Africa with Europe was squeezing shut the ancient Tessis Sea, the watery ancestor of today's Mediterranean. Around 6 million years ago, falling sea levels did their part. So did a rising rock barrier at the Strait of Gibraltar. The Mediterranean was cut off entirely from the Atlantic Ocean. It dried out almost completely for nearly 1 million years, an event geologists call the Messinian salinity crisis. Hot, dusty winds then blew off the exposed salt flats on the seafloor. They helped dry out and create the modern Sahara Desert. East Africa's climate, the book argues, was being squeezed from multiple directions at once. The fossil and genetic record bears this out in striking detail. Geneticists have traced mitochondrial Eve to roughly 200,000 years ago. She's the most recent common ancestor of all living humans through the maternal line. That date lines up precisely with a period of extreme climate swings in East Africa. A parallel genetic marker, traced through the paternal line, is sometimes called Y chromosome Adam. It points to a similar time frame. The book suggests that brutal megadroughts may have crashed early human populations down to a tiny surviving group. A recovery period then allowed that group to expand and spread its genes through what remained of humanity. We are, quite possibly, all descended from the survivors of a climate catastrophe. From that recovering population, modern humans eventually pushed out of Africa entirely. They spread across Eurasia, reaching Australia within tens of thousands of years. They carried stone tool techniques and art with them. They also carried the same flexible, adaptable mindset first forged in the unstable Rift Valley. A second wave of dramatic, climate-triggered change came roughly 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. The planet was warming nicely out of the glacial deep freeze. Then it suddenly plunged back into near-glacial cold for over 1,000 years. This event is called the Younger Dryas. It was possibly triggered by a flood of glacial meltwater shutting down ocean currents in the North Atlantic. A more dramatic, still debated theory suggests something else entirely. An exploding comet or meteor over North America may have set off the whole event. It left behind microscopic diamonds in the sediment layer. That cold spell finally broke around 9700 BC. The Earth then entered the warmest, most stable climate it had seen in 100,000 years. It was in this new stability, not before it, that change came. Small groups of people began deliberately planting wild wheat and barley. They lived in the hills of the Middle East. Agriculture, the book argues, wasn't simply a clever human invention. It was an opportunity that a newly calm climate finally made possible. New laboratory techniques have made this period far more visible than it once was. Many grasses leave behind microscopic silica structures called phytoliths, tiny fingerprints unique to each species, embedded in ancient soil. Scientists can now also detect chemical signatures of milk and beer. They find them preserved on broken pottery, thousands of years after the meal was eaten. These tools have transformed the archaeological record. A once invisible transition can now be traced almost field by field. This warm, stable window, sometimes called the Holocene optimum, was the mildest the Earth had experienced in 100,000 years. Monsoon rains pushed deep into regions that are deserts today. They turned the Sahara into a green grassland dotted with lakes. They watered an arc of fertile land running from China to the Mediterranean. It was the most generous climate window agriculture would ever get. Wheat and barley, domesticated in the Middle East, spread outward along these favorable conditions. Rice took root independently in China, and maize in Mexico. Each community solved the same puzzle in its own way. The moment, in each case, was equally favorable. That calm, though, would not last forever, and its ending produced one of this book's most striking arguments. Around 3200 BC, a sudden, sharp shift in global rainfall patterns hit nearly the entire planet at once. In Mesopotamia, the failure of winter rain starved the rivers that fed the region's early cities. Along the Nile, a sudden collapse in Ethiopian monsoon rains cut the river's flow. This may have forced the first unification of Egypt under a single king. He was desperate to manage a shrinking water supply through centralized irrigation. This same climate shift was turning the Sahara into the desert we know today. Until recently, it had been a green savanna, dotted with lakes and grazing herds. Its former inhabitants were pushed toward the shrinking lifeline of the Nile itself. On the coast of Peru, the very same global climate shift brought the opposite result. A surge of rain arrived, along with rich fishing. It fueled a population explosion of 15 to 30-fold, and the rise of South America's earliest complex societies. The same climate disturbance, in other words, helped force the birth of the state on opposite sides of the globe. It did so in opposite ways, at almost exactly the same time. This wasn't human overpopulation outrunning its resources. It was nature handing humanity, all at once, the painful and creative pressure that midwifed civilization itself. The same global pattern shows up further east too. In the Indus Valley, the first true city-states emerged after roughly 2600 BC, following a similar shift toward aridity. In China, along the Yellow River, a wave of catastrophic flooding hit around 2000 BC. It looms large in the country's own founding mythology, traditionally remembered as the trigger for its very first dynasty. Civilization, in this telling, wasn't born in stable gardens. It was born in the scramble that followed disaster. Out of that scramble came something that would long outlast any single king or harvest, writing itself. The earliest cuneiform tablets in Mesopotamia, and the first hieroglyphs in Egypt, served a strikingly mundane purpose at first. They simply tracked who owed how much grain to which temple. But these systems of artificial memory, once invented, never disappeared. They would carry the accumulated knowledge of each civilization through every later crisis this book describes. A second great climate crisis, this one striking around 1200 BC, brought the Bronze Age world crashing down. A prolonged weakening of the sun, called the Hallstatt solar minimum, pushed crucial rain belts south. It dried out the eastern Mediterranean for nearly 4 centuries. Egypt's grain shipments to its starving allies the Hittites couldn't keep pace with the drought. Lake levels across the region tell the same story. Lake Van in eastern Turkey offers a reliable gauge for the rivers feeding ancient Mesopotamia. Its water level dropped to historic lows after 1300 BC, and didn't recover for 1,000 years. The Dead Sea fell to levels even lower than those of earlier known droughts. Cities across Greece and Turkey were weakened by failed harvests. They fell to waves of migrants and raiders, later remembered as the mysterious Sea Peoples. Even the Greek historian Herodotus preserved a folk memory of this. He wrote that the Etruscans of Italy descended from refugees who fled an 18-year drought in western Turkey. Modern genetic testing of cattle breeds in an isolated Tuscan village has confirmed a Near Eastern ancestry. It matches that ancient story almost exactly. Out of this crisis, bronze trade routes collapsed and the metal grew scarce. Blacksmiths turned to a humbler, more widely available metal instead, iron. The Iron Age, and with it the entire technological foundation of the classical world, was essentially born from climate-driven scarcity. On the steppes of Central Asia, the same drying climate pushed many farming villages to abandon agriculture entirely. Within a few centuries, their descendants had transformed into mounted warrior tribes. Among them were the Scythians, armed with powerful compound bows. These horsemen would harass the settled civilizations of Eurasia for the next 2,500 years. Rome's own story complicates any simple climate narrative, and the book is honest about that complexity. For roughly 4 centuries, through the height of the empire, the Mediterranean climate stayed remarkably stable and mild. Rome's decline, when it finally came, seems to have been driven less by drought than by something else entirely, disease. Starting in 165 AD, the Antonine Plague struck. It was likely smallpox, carried home by legions returning from the east. It killed perhaps a third of the empire's population over the following decades. Tax records from rural Egypt show some districts losing 70 to 90% of their population within a single decade. The plague likely killed Marcus Aurelius himself. He was the last of the so-called 5 good emperors. Together they had guided Rome through nearly a century of relative stability. Roman silver mining in Spain collapsed in these same years. The number of shipwrecks recovered from the Mediterranean seafloor drops sharply too. It's a quiet signal that long-distance trade was grinding to a halt. Further waves followed: Cyprian's plague in 251 AD, likely smallpox or measles arriving from Ethiopia. Finally came the Justinianic plague of 542 AD. Ancient DNA, extracted directly from the teeth of plague victims, has now confirmed something striking. This last plague was caused by the same bacterium behind the later Black Death. Rome didn't simply fall to barbarians at the gates. It was hollowed out from within by recurring biological disaster. The historian William McNeill traced the deeper cause in his own classic study of plagues. He pointed to the growing web of trade routes binding Eurasia together. The Silk Road carried goods between China, India, and the Mediterranean. It carried pathogens along with them, fusing once separate disease pools into one devastating whole. The medieval world's own reckoning arrived as an almost unbearable double blow. Beginning in the 1300s, a cluster of unusually weak solar cycles combined with a series of massive volcanic eruptions. Together they plunged the northern hemisphere into what's now called the Little Ice Age. Storms and floods destroyed harvests across northern Europe between 1315 and 1322. This catastrophe, called the Great Famine, may have killed 1/10 of the region's entire population. A prolonged stretch of unusually weak solar activity, named the Wolf Minimum, ran through this same period. It helps explain why the cold proved so persistent. A livestock plague killed off half its cattle in the very same years. Even the Vikings felt this same cooling far to the north. Norse settlers had farmed Greenland since around 1000 AD. The colony's western settlement collapsed entirely by 1340. The last eastern outposts vanished by 1500. They were abandoned to the encroaching cold and to Inuit hunters advancing from the Arctic. Then, in 1347, the Black Death itself arrived. The bubonic plague raced along trade routes from Asia into the Mediterranean and across Europe. It killed as much as half the population it touched within just 6 years. Genetic testing has settled the question. It examined victims buried in a London plague pit, dug specifically for the catastrophe of 1348. The same plague bacterium had struck under Justinian 8 centuries earlier. It was out of the smoking ruins of this medieval catastrophe, paradoxically, that the modern world began to take shape. Here the book makes its boldest claim about human agency. The mechanical inventions of the British Industrial Revolution didn't trigger an instant economic miracle. Older histories often claimed the steam engines and spinning machines did exactly that. Economic data tells a different story. English growth remained slow and modest for fully 50 years after James Watt's improved steam engine appeared, in the 1760s. What changed first, and what changed everything else afterward, was population. Starting in the 1730s, English numbers began rising steadily for the first time in centuries. They were no longer cut down by the recurring plagues and famines of the agrarian past. For the first time in recorded history, population growth had decisively escaped the grip of climate and disease. Inoculation against smallpox spread through Britain and its American colonies over the 18th century. It played a critical role in finally breaking that ancient grip. Cleaner water, basic public health measures, and a more reliable food supply all reinforced the trend. The cycle of crisis mortality had haunted every previous society in this story. The book argues it was being dismantled, piece by piece, for the very first time. That demand from a rapidly growing population, more than any single invention, is what finally launched self-sustaining economic growth. Economic historians have long debated why this particular surge proved self-sustaining where earlier ones had not. The book's answer points squarely at demography rather than mechanical genius alone. This growing English population was tightly bound to a much wider, and far darker, global economy. Cheap checked cotton cloth, manufactured in England's new water-powered mills, became a key currency in the African slave trade. It helped pay for the very people forced to clear land and grow cotton and sugar across the Americas. Here's a strange twist in the global carbon ledger. West Africa's own population was falling for 2 centuries under the weight of the slave trade. Its forests regrew and absorbed more carbon than the region emitted. Meanwhile, the wider Atlantic economy it fed began pumping carbon into the air at a new, rising rate. The book closes by arguing that modern humanity has broken free of the ancient cycle of climate-driven crisis. But it has begun to overwhelm the planet's capacity to absorb our impact instead. Synthetic fertilizer runoff is creating spreading dead zones in the world's oceans. Arctic permafrost, frozen since the Ice Age, is beginning to release ancient stores of methane and carbon dioxide. This threatens a feedback loop that could accelerate warming beyond our control. The book catalogues other warning signs too. Roughly 60% of the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer spread across modern farmland eventually washes into rivers and out to sea. It fuels algae blooms that create lifeless dead zones. They stretch from the Gulf of Mexico to the coasts of Japan, China, and northern Europe. Warming, increasingly acidic oceans are stressing the coral reefs that anchor entire marine ecosystems. By one rough estimate, humanity was already consuming a striking share of the planet's resources by the year 2000. Between 16 and 23% of its annual biological productivity. That's a previously unthinkable share for a single species to claim for itself. The book's haunting final question is raised in its title itself. Was Thomas Malthus, so wrong about most of human history, about to be proven tragically right about our own moment? The book is careful to distinguish this danger from the deniers and easy optimists. Both dominate much of the public debate. The underlying science of a warming planet, it stresses, is not seriously contested among specialists. What remains genuinely uncertain is only the pace, the regional details, and how well human institutions will respond. The book draws a sharp historical irony from its own argument here. For nearly all of human history, our ancestors had no power to influence the climate reshaping their lives. Today, for the first time, we hold that power directly in our hands. The central political question of our age is simply whether we will choose to use it. What does this body of research actually contribute to historical scholarship? The book enters a genuinely contested debate. It challenges the dominant, Malthusian reading of the past, most famously associated with Jared Diamond's collapse. That reading tends to blame ancient societal failures on human overpopulation and self-inflicted environmental damage. Brooke's central, deliberately provocative claim is that this gets the history backward. Until the 18th century, he argues, pre-modern societies were strikingly resilient and adaptive. Serious crises came not from people simply outrunning their own resources. They came from sudden, externally imposed climate shocks that no amount of careful planning could have fully prevented. The book leans here on the Danish economist Esther Boserup. Decades ago, she argued that human societies tend to innovate their way around resource pressure, rather than collapsing under it. Brooke extends her insight across the whole of pre-modern history. Societies that seem, in hindsight, doomed by their own growth were usually managing reasonably well. They struggled only once nature intervened. That argument, however, depends entirely on the quality of paleoclimate data. That data remains a genuinely live and contested scientific frontier. Correlation and causation are notoriously hard to untangle across such vast stretches of time. The book's critics make a fair point here. A climate shift and a political collapse can arrive in the same century. That alone isn't proof one caused the other. Some specific causal claims rest on correlations that critics could reasonably push back against. Specialists who study any single region in deep detail often have far more local nuance available. A single sweeping global chapter can't fully accommodate it. Consider the precise timing linking mid-Holocene climate shifts to the simultaneous rise of early states across entirely different continents. That link is somewhat looser than the book's confident narrative voice suggests. The book's own treatment of Rome is admirably honest about a genuine ambiguity here. It finds only modest, contested climate signals across the empire's slow decline. The truly decisive blow, it argues instead, came from epidemic disease. That's a useful reminder that the book's framework leaves real room for biological and political causation alongside climate itself. This is, by design, a global history. It concentrates on regions with the deepest archaeological and climate records, like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Europe. It inevitably gives shorter treatment to vast stretches of sub-Saharan Africa and the Pacific. The same is true for the Americas beyond Peru and Mexico, where comparable data is sparser. There's also a deeper methodological tension worth noting. The book relies heavily on ice cores, ocean sediments, and cave deposits to reconstruct ancient climate. This evidence has only become available to historians within the past 2 or 3 decades. This means the book's most distinctive claims are also its newest and least battle-tested. They rest on a scientific foundation that specialists are still actively revising and debating. Diamond's Collapse builds its case study by case study, almost like courtroom evidence. Brooks' book instead moves like a sweeping prosecution brief, covering every region at once. Some readers will reasonably want more space given to counterarguments within each individual case. This is a genuinely ambitious, occasionally overconfident book. It suits anyone willing to see the rise and fall of empires as, in some real sense, weather. What does any of this mean for how we live now? The book's deepest lesson may be an uncomfortable kind of humility. It's the kind earned only by looking honestly at deep time. For nearly the entirety of the human story, our ancestors survived through resilience and adaptation. They faced forces utterly beyond their control. They did not survive through any triumphant mastery of nature. Only in the last 2 or 3 centuries did humanity escape that ancient vulnerability. It escaped only by trading that vulnerability for an entirely new one. We now pose a danger to the planet's own basic operating systems. The real through line of this rough journey was never steady human progress. It was never a story of conquering an indifferent nature, one invention at a time. It was always a far more dramatic partnership and a far less comfortable one. An unstable planet and a remarkably resilient species. That species' luck, this book quietly warns, may finally be running out.